Director Joseph Juhn's documentary film Jeronimo, The Untold Tales of Koreans in Cuba, depicts life of the Korean Cuban community's respected leader, the late Jeronimo Lim.
The serendipitous nature of how everything started, to remind themselves of who they are and where they come from.
Over the span of 3 years, director Joseph Juhn traveled 17 cities in 4 countries, including Cuba, to film Jeronimo, the work that embodies his passion for telling the stories of overseas Koreans in different parts of the world.
They compliment to me, so I think I've maybe done a little bit of my share.
Director Joseph Juhn himself is a Korean American who used to work as a lawyer in New York. He unfolded the second chapter of his life as a film director. Profound stories delivered by director Joseph Juhn await on today's Heart to Heart. Welcome to the studio. Thank you so much for joining us today, Joseph. We just took a look at a scene, or rather a group of people singing ARIRANG, which is a very meaningful song to Koreans. I would say that any Korean would listen to the song or even watch that scene, and it might even bring tears to their eyes,
Sure.
right? So I'd like to ask you about that scene from your documentary film, Jeronimo, and could you also tell us about this documentary film?
Sure. It certainly did bring tears to my eyes when I was documenting that. I didn't know they were going to sing Arirang. What happened was, so there's a small town called Cardenas in Cuba. There's a group of young and old Korean descendants of Cuba that get together on a regular basis to remind themselves of who they are and where they come from. Singing Arirang is part of that ritual, and we were lucky to be there when they had that meeting. My film, Jeronimo, is about a Korean fighter who fought in the Cuban Revolution, who later serves in the Cuban government and becomes a vice minister. But after his retirement, he goes through a serious transformation and decides to dedicate the rest of his life reconstructing and rebuilding his sense of Korean identity and the Korean community in Cuba.
So what made you, initially, what made you decide to cast light upon Korean Cubans?
I think one of the most magical elements of this whole project is the serendipitous nature of how everything started. I was an attorney in New York. At the end of 2015, I decided to go on a backpacking trip to Cuba. And the first person I met at the airport who came to pick me up from a hostel I booked happens to be a middle-aged Asian woman. I got curious and I asked her, would you happen to be Chinese?
I see.
And she says, no, I'm third-generation Korean. I later discovered that she's a daughter of Jeronimo, who was the main character of my film.
Yes.
And the rest is history.
So, it all began from this coincidental meeting. So she actually had come to the airport to pick you up, to take you to the hostel that you were planning on staying at.
Right.
Now, you briefly mentioned that you were an attorney, so you're an attorney turned film director now.
Sure.
Now, these two fields are vastly different, very different. But I understand that you took charge of the scripting, to the filming, to even the editing. You did it all on your own?
It was extremely difficult. And one thing to mention is I did study film back in undergraduate.
I see.
But never did I work as a professional filmmaker or editor or any of that sort. So everything was a learning process for me. I had to basically educate myself on how to do everything that you just forementioned. And hence, it took me 3 years to complete this project.
How long did it take for you to put this project, this documentary film together? And I understand that you met many, many people.
I cannot count them because it goes over 60 people. But the truth of the matter is, I went to Cuba for backpacking at the end of 2015, and I started fundraising. So when I first went to Cuba, that was August of 2016. From that point on, I traveled to 4 different countries, 17 different cities, and met with over 60 people who basically crossed paths with Jeronimo at some point in their lives. So I became very obsessed with finding out who Jeronimo is through the voices of others.
If you could perhaps maybe tell us about one person, I mean, is there a single person? I mean, who happens to be, of the 60-some people that you met while you worked on this project, remains most memorable, and also why?
It's a person I haven't met, which is Jeronimo.
I see.
Jeronimo passed away 13 years ago now. Everyone was talking about Jeronimo and how, I'm careful to use this word, how divine he was in many respects. So I truly felt like I've discovered an unsung hero that is not known widely to the public.
Yes.
But aside from Jeronimo, if I have to pick one, there's another Korean descendant that we ran into by sheer accident. And he happens to be the oldest Korean descendant living in Cuba. And it's a long story, and it's a sort of a spoiler from the movie.
Okay.
So I'll keep that to the audience to watch.
All right, I
Yeah.
see. So we're going to have to watch the film to find
Please.
out more. Now, the interviews, most of the interviews, or at least, is it 35 or more? Correct me if I'm wrong, but they were conducted in Spanish. Do you speak Spanish? Are you fluent in?
Poquito.
Un poquito.
Un poquito.
Yes, same here. That's all I know how to say.
That's all I know how to say either.
Then the translation must have been very difficult. Did you maybe work with a professional translator?
No, so this goes on to speak to the overwhelming support that I received from so many different people. I've received fundings from over 500 people through Kickstarter and other means. And at least a dozen people volunteered to translate either from English to Korean, Korean to English, Spanish to Korean, and Spanish to English, and so forth. One particular lady, I must say, who reached out to me on social media one day. This is soon after I came back from my second Cuba trip. Why don't I help you for free?
Oh my.
And help you translate all your interviews? And obviously, I thought it was a scam. I thought someone was going after my footage.
It's too good to be true, or
Exactly.
yeah.
It was too good to be true. So I did my own due diligence. I looked her up, and I verified her credentials. And ultimately, we hopped onto a Skype phone, and I was able to place her name with her face, and knew that she was a genuine supporter. And so I started sending her files, interview files. And from that point on, for about 8-9 months, she sent me a perfectly translated and transcribed Spanish to English.
So you revisited Cuba in 2016. So this is when you actually revisited Cuba with your camera to actually start filming this project. How many hours of footage does the film include? And I also want to ask how long the documentary film is.
So the entire film hovers around 250 hours. And the challenge was to cut that down to a 90-minute film. And so currently I have a 90-minute version, which is likely to be the final version. When I first initiated this project, I've envisioned maybe this turning into a 30-minute YouTube clip, right? I didn't think of anything of this scale, that this will evolve into something much larger than myself. So mainly due to my lack of capabilities, and because I didn't know what I was really getting myself into. It took much, much longer than I would hope for. And yet, I took all that time really deliberating what would be the best way to storytell and pay a proper tribute to this really great character, Jeronimo Lim. Yeah,
So that's 250 hours, did you say?
that's correct.
And you had to cut that down to 90 minutes. I mean,
Yeah.
How do you make such decisions? I mean, when it comes to editing, you know, you want to keep every scene, everything that you filmed, you want to include it into the film, but it's not possible, I guess. So, I mean, even when it comes to, I guess, editing our program, it's a 20-some minute program, and we have our whole team working on this one program. They start to edit, they go back and find something else to edit, to add, or either take out. So it sounds like a very long process, an ongoing process.
Sure.
How is it for you?
So a lot of people say that documentary, the real work is made in documentaries during the post-production process, right? And that was certainly the case with me. The reason I went back to Cuba to shoot and to start this project was because the only solid information that I had on Jeronimo was that he fought in the Cuban Revolution as a Korean person and that he worked with Che Guevara. And for me, I grew up reading Motorcycle Diaries by Che Guevara. I used to really idolize him as a young, idealistic person myself. The idea that this iconic global figure, Che Guevara, there's a Korean working side by Che, really blew me away. And so he literally transformed the Korean community in Cuba. And I wanted to discover as much as I can within the limited resources and time. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I had, at the end of the day, 250 hours of footage that I didn't know what to do with. So post-production, the editing process was really dismantling everything that I had and reconstructing a story of this humble hero, I would call.
Wow.
And so obviously there are many sleepless nights with caffeine, fiercely arguing with my editor.
Sure.
People say that a director typically never works with one editor only throughout the whole process.
Is that because you argue and then you kind of fall?
There's a divorce process.
I see.
But my editor has been wonderful. Him being Cuban, he was able to shed lights on the Cuban historical side that I wasn't aware of. So with my Korean and American knowledge and his Cuban knowledge came together. And I think we finally came to a decent piece. I mean, mind you that I don't think any creators finally look at their product and say, hey, I'm satisfied with this. I'm never satisfied with this, but at least I can tolerate what we have now. So
I think it might be wonderful for us to actually take a look, take a peek at the highlights of Jeronimo. So let's do that and then continue on talking about Jeronimo Lim and much more. So let's take a look.
Sure.
My name is Nelson Lim. I'm the grandson of Jeronimo Lim King, a Korean who fought in the Cuban Revolution.
임은조 선생님은 쿠바 한인사의 가장 중심 인물이라고 할 수 있습니다.
It's a story of return. The story of Koreans in Cuba is one of search for self and search for a home away from home.
They worked as slaves, literally, all their lives. You understand? They're slaves.
It's one of the saddest stories you ever want to hear.
While Fidel Castro was in the mountains, in the city, there was a clandestine group. Jeronimo was part of that.
Era una actividad secreta. Los detalles no se daban, aunque fuera familia.
학생 교수일 때 바티스타 투쟁에 참여해서 감옥에 들어갔죠.
칼막스 추종자.
Cuba y la revolución cubana seguirían luchando y seguirían resistiendo.
He said he was recruited to be a spy.
위대한 수령 김일성 동식에 따른 쿠바의 디젤 가스로 동지와 상봉을 하셨습니다.
Hubo un episodio en su vida. Él visitó Corea del Norte.
The people of Cuba are living in a crisis, a special period.
아버님 말씀을 제가 너무 안 들은 것 같아요.
전체성을 지켜야 된다. 좋은 한국이다.
Como mismo se dedicó principio a trabajar para el gobierno, con ese mismo entusiasmo, se dedicó a trabajar por la asociación.
그걸 고민하는 표정을 봤어요.
Ninguna, completamente. Estoy convencida, segura.
쇼킹한 얘기죠, 사실은.
나는 임은조입니다. 오늘 기쁜 날입니다.
Now, it is our turn to continue Jeronimo's legacy.
So that was 임은조, Jeronimo Lim. Could you tell us more about Jeronimo Lim?
I'll be happy to. 114 years ago, there were 1,000 Koreans who departed from the port of Incheon all the way to Mexico. They were essentially sold as indentured servants. 300 of the 1,000 people eventually went to Cuba 16 years later, and there Jeronimo was born to an indentured servant parents. Many colliding ideologies and world affairs happening in the Caribbean. Jeronimo ended up becoming the first Korean to attend college in Cuba out of the 300 Koreans. And one of his classmates was Fidel Castro. And from there on, he took part in a lot of social movements, and he eventually participates in the Cuban Revolution, serves in the Castro government as vice minister, and retires. But this is also when the Soviet Union and a series of other communist bloc and nations also collapsed, and Jeronimo goes through a serious transformation about ideological matters, right? Mind you that it's a time period where there's a colliding, conflicting battle between ideologies, right? Between capitalism and communism, between America and Cuba, between North Korea and South Korea. So Jeronimo, being stuck in the middle of all this, is someone who really struggled with the notion of seeking meaning in life. Right? I tell other people who don't know anything about Jeronimo that he's just like Cuban Tosa Nanchango. Obviously, this doesn't do justice to both figures, but for me, that's how heroic the life he lived was. He's someone who struggled a lot with, I think, the notion of his dual identities, how he can be both 100% Cuban and how 100% Korean at the same time. I think the case of Jeronimo is interesting because if you look at his life, the first half of his life was 100% Cuban. He dedicated to the ideals of the Cuban Revolution and communism in the beginning. But later, there's a transformation. There's a turning point. And then afterwards, he dedicates 100% of all his energy and passion into reconstructing his sense of Korean identity.
So, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Jeronimo is definitely a role model for many Koreans, not only spread across the world, but also Koreans. Koreans. Now, you worked as a lawyer. You were an attorney before you became a film director. So I'd like to ask you the kind of work you were involved in as a lawyer and what or how your family reacted when you told them about your decision to switch from a lawyer to a film director. How did they react?
I'm sure they didn't know that it's going to take this long to produce the film. It seems ages ago since I practiced law, but before this I was working at a Korean government agency in New York as an in-house counsel. And my primary job was to basically help Korean small and medium companies come to the US, and I would be advising them on intellectual property and basic corporate law issues so that they don't get into lawsuits.
I see.
So I was a middleman trying to connect the two worlds together.
I see.
Yeah. With respect to my parents, so my younger brother, he's also an attorney, but he's a human rights attorney. So you can imagine, my parents, they broke their backs to support both of their sons to go through law school, undergrad. And one of them became a filmmaker, another a human rights lawyer. So there's not much of a return on investments on their part. But they've been, they're kind of eccentric. They've always been very supportive of what I do. And I don't remember a moment when they forced their will upon our career choices. And I think they also see the value and the meaning behind the Jeronimo work, right? So now they're fully supportive and they're bragging about their son on
that's wonderful.
social media. Yeah.
Now, I'd like to shift our focus to the people that you met. This is after you began your career as a film director. We've actually asked you for some photos. We've gathered some pictures of your acquaintances, so let's take a look at a few.
She is Lee So-eun, 가수 Lee So-eun, the singer. When I first initiated this project, she immediately became one of the biggest supporters.
Oh, I
right?
see.
And she's been telling me throughout the whole process, Joseph, I want to do a 재능 기부. I want to help you with my singing skills or music skills. And quite recently, only 3 months ago, I asked her, hey, were you serious about the offer all throughout the way? And she's like, yes, I am. And so I'm like, hey, can you sing our theme song? And so she sang it, and it's beautiful. And you'll find it on the movie. Yeah. So Monk Pomyun, I've always respected him. I'm a big fan of his podcast as well. He's also an advocate of finding one's identity for self-enlightenment and empowerment purposes. So I got to meet him, and I eventually interviewed him as part of my film. So yeah, a famous actor, a big, more than an actor, he's an advocate of human rights and refugee rights issues.
Yes.
I cold messaged him on social media.
Oh.
Yeah, and I said, hey, my name is Joseph Juhn. I'm working on this film that I think you can sympathize and empathize with. He got back to me and said, hey, give me a call when you're in Korea. And then he was able to really sympathize with the story of my film because now he's defending the rights of many refugees and migrants in Korea. The very idea that Koreans were also migrants and refugees. There were even slaves that went to Mexico and Cuba 100 years ago.
Yes.
Really, he was able to find a connection in the overlap of the two narratives. So since then, he's been, pushing me to connect me to other film industry folks, and I'm very grateful for his contribution.
You'd like to support a scholarship foundation to help Korean students in Cuba? Yes. Tell us about this.
Yeah, I made this proclamation 2 years ago on a TV program. This is when I was just starting out, and so I was more innocent.
2 years
not
ago.
Not to say that I don't have such intentions, but I just realized the difficulties of making a film, distributing, and gaining profits from a documentary filmmaking.
Right.
But certainly, if I make any profits from this, I would love to donate and support for the Korean students to come overseas to either Korea or to the U.S. to study, because some of their grandparents and great-grandparents supported Korea's independence movement all the way from Cuba.
Yes.
Right? We can't do anything to pay back their kindness and their patriotism, but maybe we can do something for the future generations, right? So hopefully I'll make profit. Hopefully this will be distributed throughout Korea. Yes.
Because if you think about it, I mean, it's obviously our story, our ancestors. It's our history. It's our story.
Yes.
I want to ask you from a director point of view, perspective of Jeronimo, which aspects or what about the documentary film do you hope that your audiences will pay most attention to, or which message do you hope to deliver most strongly?
Again, I want to make this parallel contrast between the Koreans and the Jewish people. How Jewish people dealt with a notion of diaspora was always a wonder to me, because again, we lost our country for 40 years and people spread all across the world. But Jewish people, they lost their country for 3,000 years. And yet they still hold on to their sense of identity and history and roots, right? And I interviewed this one Jewish rabbi who told me that the more you limit the definition of what being Jewish is, the more self-destructive it becomes, right? And I want to really pose that question in this film. I noticed a tendency of Koreans wanting to limit the definition of what truly being Korean is, right? Koreans are limiting what it means to be Korean, the definition itself. My message, the message that I hope the people will find out from this film is why don't we broaden that concept? Why don't we broaden that definition and be more inclusive of whoever that came from this motherland? Even though they're 5 generations away, they don't look anything like Korean because they're mixed many, many times. And maybe they don't even speak Korean or eat Korean food. If they want to retain that sense of identity and if they want to connect with the motherland and the roots, why don't we welcome their efforts, right? And I think Jeronimo was a figure that really tried to reconnect with his roots. And if people, this movie can give an opportunity for people to really to contemplate on the notion of Korean diaspora. That would be my only wish.
Thank you so much for your time, and I do wish you the best of luck with Jeronimo.
Thanks.
And yes, I hope that your hope or dreams come true about how, I truly hope that this film, documentary film, will help to spread awareness, shed light on Korean diasporas. Thank you so much once again for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much.
감사합니다.
감사합니다.